Well, good morning. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And I would also like to briefly thank Loa for inviting me to talk today, along with my co-author, Marcello Canuto, and also to Tina and all of the members of the event staff for helping to put this together. So last night, for those of you who are here, we heard a little bit about royal ancestors at Copan and Quirigua, and today now, of course, we've heard about the other 99%. And I'd like to move today, actually now, back to the 1%. But what I'd really like to begin talking about is the way that ancestor veneration and other ancestral practices were used strategically by Maya rulers for their own ends. So ancestor veneration was a way in which Maya rulers legitimized their rule by creating connections to important past rulers. And by asserting their hereditary links to these ancestors, new rulers claimed authority over commoners as well as other elite lineages. So it's a very common refrain, I'm sure you've all heard, that the winners are the ones who get to write history, right? And we know that Maya rulers commissioned monuments in which they presented their royal dynasties as unbroken lines of kings. But we should always remember that hidden beneath this official history are more details, and that the actual things that were happening in royal courts might have been a little bit more complicated. If we look at other ancient civilizations and hereditary monarchies, it becomes clear that the smooth succession of kings was not always guaranteed, and that royal courts were full of other noble lineages in which other claimants to the throne were always waiting in the wings, waiting for an opportunity to maybe come in and claim power. And the same was true for the classic Maya, even if that's not always apparent in the hieroglyphic record. So in this talk, we'll be discussing the ways in which classic period Maya of La Corona manipulated ancestors for their own political ends. Epigraphic and archaeological research at the site reveals a history of conflict between at least two elite families. Ancestor veneration, ancestor desecration, mythologies about ancient origins, and strategic marriages were all strategies that rulers used in an attempt to outdo rival factions in their bid for authority. Okay, so before I begin to talk about these strategies, I'd like to give you some background about the site of La Corona. So it's located up here in northwestern Petén, actually not that far from the Guatemalan border. And here we have a map of the primary groups of the site. And as you can see, it's built among this group of seasonal lakes that we call cibales. And these probably would have, they would have given the Maya of this region access to aquatic resources like fish and mollusks. And they probably also made this an especially fertile place to be doing agricultural activities. The earliest occupation at La Corona dates to the early classic period. And a later hieroglyphic inscription from the site records possibly a founding event that took place in AD 314. And I'm going to be discussing that a little more later on in the presentation. However, it should be noted that in the general region of La Corona, there were other sites that dated to earlier in the pre-classic. So this founding event shouldn't really be seen as an in-migration of people to the region, but really just a local redistribution of people on the landscape. Okay. So during the early classic period, the powerful Khan dynasty, or Snake dynasty, began a program of political expansion. And at this time, the Khan dynasty had its capital up here at Sibunche, but it really began to interfere politically with sites very far afield. And when I say interfere, I mean that they were carrying out warfare events, installing rulers as vassals at these other sites in places as far away as the Usumacinta River down here. And during this time, La Corona fell under the sway of this dynasty, at least for part of the early classic period. By the late classic, the Khan dynasty had moved its capital down here, which is much closer to La Corona. La Corona's here. And so this influence over the affairs of the La Corona dynasty became much more pronounced and very much more involved. So during the late classic, this dynasty was able to control a network of alliances throughout the Maya region. So this is a graphic that was created by Simon Martin. This is actually a recently updated version of it that includes some new sites, including La Corona. And this graphic is really great because it shows us that Maya politics were really more of a network than they were territorially based. So up here we have that Khan dynasty at Calakmul and Sivonche. And all these black lines represent some sort of a friendly contact, and red lines represent a hostile contact. And as you can see, they really are ruling over this vast network of allies and vassals, and they really have a very antagonistic relationship here with Tikal, which has its own network. And this graphic does not, I mean, the sites are roughly where they are on the geographical landscape, but what's important about this is that geography was not always the most important thing when these sites were creating these networks of alliances. However, in the case of La Corona, geography does seem to have played a role. That's because La Corona is located here along a very strategic trade route. So all these sites, Ushul, La Corona, El Peru, Zapote Bobal, Dos Pilas, and Canquen, all were allies of Calakmul during the Classic period. And this would have allowed Calakmul to control this trade route and to get goods from the highlands. So, for example, they could have gotten quetzal feathers, jade, or marine shells from the Pacific Ocean. These are all wealth items for the Classic Maya. So this wealth was flowing through La Corona, and that's probably one of the reasons why Calakmul was so interested in maintaining control over La Corona's local dynasty. Because of its strategic position on this trade route, that also means that La Corona was able to get quite a bit of wealth out of this arrangement. So we find quite a bit of wealth in the archaeological record, and we'll be seeing that in the presentation. And in addition to just having good stuff, the rulers of La Corona were able to spend this wealth also to commission a great deal of hieroglyphic monuments. So La Corona actually has a large or a long hieroglyphic history compared to other sites of similar size. And this has allowed us to reconstruct a lot of detail about the dynastic history of the site. So if you're unfamiliar with the way that anthropologists typically show genealogy, the triangles represent men and the circles represent women on this graphic. So here in the black triangles is one lineage of kings of La Corona. And in the gray, you have kings from Calakmul or Sivonche. And as you can see, that these two lineages actually intermarried several times throughout the history of the site. And I'm going to be talking about this later on in the presentation. Over here on the right side, you have a series of other rulers of La Corona. These are known about either through epigraphic records or through the archaeological record. And what's interesting about these men over here is that they do not seem to be part of the lineage that I've highlighted in black. So we have at least two different lineages here which ruled La Corona at some point during its history. And I'm going to be revisiting this graphic periodically throughout the presentation, so you don't have to memorize it right now. Okay. All right, so let's move on now to begin talking about some of the strategies that these rulers used in their conflicts between these lineages. Oh, just to give you a sense of the site, this is a map of La Corona. Over here, we have the main palace group. This is the palace here. Then we have this other monumental group over here that we call Coronitas. And then there's a series of other residential groups scattered around. And we're going to actually be looking at this one down here in a little bit, too. Okay, so at La Corona so far, we have only been able to identify royal tombs in this group here, but we expect more royal tombs to be forthcoming. So here's a map of that Coronitas group. We've found 4 royal tombs so far. Unfortunately, these two down here, burial 1 and 2, were looted. Burial 8 was probably also looted. We're not quite sure about that. More work needs to be done to clarify the stratigraphy. There's actually a large looter's trench right on the back here. And then during the last season, Antonieta Cajas dug down, found the burial down. She found a cut in the bedrock, and the only thing that was there was a jaw, like a human jaw. So where did the rest of the body go? Probably it was dug out by looters, but we have to clarify that context more and figure out what was going on. So the only intact burial from this group we have here is burial 6. So all of these tombs were created by cutting a chamber into the bedrock below the soil, and then the deceased occupants were placed in these chambers, and then the pyramids were built on top of them. So in the cases of burials 1, 2, and 6, the bones were treated with red pigment. This is some fragments of the cranium of burial 2. So this shows us that these skeletons, or that the bodies would have been allowed to decay and then been treated with red pigment before the funerary shrines were constructed on top, because in the case of La Corona, none of these tombs could have been re-entered after the funerary shrines were constructed. Okay. So the tombs were then sealed with perishable wooden roofs, and then funerary shrines were constructed over them. In the case of burial 1, we actually have a relatively small funerary shrine. So this is the phase of construction from that tomb is highlighted here in red. Probably part of this would have been destroyed when the later phase was constructed, but I suspect that the actual platform of the funerary shrine would have been only about 1 meter high, and then there would have been some sort of a perishable structure constructed on top of that. In the case of the other royal tombs that we have from this group, the funerary shrines were much taller. This is burial 6 of structure 13R2. So here we have that chamber cut into bedrock, and then we have this large, about 8-meter funerary shrine constructed on top of it. So the individuals buried in these tombs were given grave assemblages that reflected their status. So in the case of burial 1, we recovered jade, even though the context was looted, the looters had left behind some jade. Burial 6 was unlooted, and it actually lacked jade. It also lacked marine shell. So this suggests that at the time that the person was interred in burial 6, that the site probably didn't have far-off trade contacts. Nevertheless, we recovered 15 ceramic vessels. Many of these were very well made with thin walls, suggesting a master potter. Also, numerous faunal remains were recovered, including hundreds of freshwater shells, which would have been available locally at La Corona, as well as the skeletons of a turtle and a crocodile. On top of the wooden roof of the tomb, the Maya placed a woven mat, which we have the impression of in the fill above. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, mats were symbols of Maya rulership. And then finally, on top of this, the Maya placed a lithic deposit consisting of both obsidian and chert. Now, we weren't able to excavate out the entire deposit, but we estimate that it would have been about 20,000 to 30,000 pieces of chert and obsidian. And similar lithic deposits have been found at other royal burials in the Penn, especially during the early Classic. So all of these things indicate that this was a royal burial. And the similar things that were recovered in the other tombs indicate that this area was really a precinct where royal burials occurred during the early Classic period. So lesser elites were also venerated as ancestors at La Corona. We have elite burials here in these structures in the main group, as well as one down here in this other elite residential group. And these burials are non-royal, but they also contain wealth items. And it seems as though in these cases, they did not receive full funerary shrines the way the royal ancestors did, but instead were buried in probably residential or perhaps administrative structures. So in burial 3, a number of exotic wealth items are recovered. Here we have marine shells, jade, actually some really nicely carved jade and marine shells, as well as these. Here we have a polychrome vessel. In burial 4, we had similar items, and in addition, we had this dog's tooth necklace that was buried with the individual. Both burials 3 and 4 were excavated by project member Jan Desecration. And then in burial 8, burial 7, we have these ceramic vessels, these nice polychrome ceramics, and these were excavated by Jorge Pontasa. So it's important to note that not all deceased individuals at La Corona were treated as ancestors. So the status of being an important ancestor was only reserved for people who were of a special importance during their lifetimes. And by way of example, we can compare these types of things with burial 5. So burial 5, basically what happened was we had an undergraduate student from the University del Valle, and he was asked to dig a 1-by-1 meter test pit in a plaza floor as a means of getting some stratigraphic and ceramic information about that plaza so we could date it. We thought that was a pretty straightforward thing, and so we put this undergraduate on it, and he found a human skull. So we quickly told him to stop doing that, and then our project osteologist, Aaron Patterson, came and completed the excavation of the burial. So this burial was found under a plaza floor. It was basically just discarded along with smashed ceramics that made up the fill of the plaza, other animal bones. It wasn't in any particular orientation, except perhaps just parallel to this structure next to it. And it wasn't buried with any special grave goods, except perhaps this fragment of a metate or grinding stone that was found on the chest of the individual. So this is just an example of someone who was probably a non-ancestor and was buried simply to dispose of the body in some way. Okay. So ancestor veneration was not the only strategy used by La Corona elites to compete with one another for legitimacy. The opposite strategy was also used, ancestor desecration, or the negation of competing lineage cults. So there's several examples of this strategy being used in the archaeological record at La Corona. The earliest dates to the mid-7th century. So let's visit the circumstances surrounding this example. So here we have ruler Chacaunabchan, and he was the son of a previous ruler, Sakmas. But between the reign of these two kings, we also have the reign of this other guy here, Kukahau. Okay, so La Corona Panel 2 gives a few details about the series of events surrounding these accessions. In 625, we have Sakmas, who accedes to power. In 655, Kukahau accedes to power, but we're not given any details about his parentage or any relationship of any kind. Shortly thereafter, Sakmas dies, quote, at the edge of a stone, or something. That's what the text reads. So that suggests some sort of a violent coup. But in 658, Kukahau in turn dies in a violent death, and Chacaunabchan accedes on the same day. So this series of events suggests a coup by Kukahau, followed by a counter coup 3 years later by Sakmas's son and heir. So this tells us that Chacaunabchan came to power under violent circumstances, very probably in a feud with a man from a different lineage. So it's very interesting that just 35 days after Chacaunabchan accedes to power and his predecessor dies this violent death, Chacaunabchan builds temples for 3 patron deities of La Corona, as described here on panel 1. So I just want to take a minute here to plug my dissertation. I actually wrote my dissertation largely about the circumstances that I'm describing now, and more generally about patron deities among the Maya and the differences between patron deities and ancestors. Now, some people have assumed that patron deities, which belong to specific Maya sites, were actually just deified royal ancestors. But I can tell you, after doing a lot of research, that this is not actually true, and that patron deities served a completely different religious and political function than deceased ancestors. So, archaeological evidence at La Corona suggests that these three temples to these new patron deities were constructed on top of old ancestor shrines. So let me show you that. So here we have these two burials that I talked about before, burial 6 and 2. There probably was a similar burial here in this structure, but this structure is so badly looted that it's too dangerous to excavate. And archaeological evidence suggests that these three new patron deity temples constructed in 658 were built right on top of those old funerary shrines. So here we have a profile of one of those structures. As you can see, this new construction was a really thin layer because he only had 35 days to complete it. Didn't actually continue onto the back. It really just built a new facade for these three new temples. And because of the distinctions between ancestor veneration and patron deity veneration, this is a true change in function for these temples. Something really significant is going on here. So if we look again at the history of these rulers of La Corona, this really suggests that coup, this guy who was recently overthrown, is actually of the same lineage as these burials that were replaced. And that Chakanabchan was attempting to stamp out a rival lineage by co-opting their ancestor shrines for his own purpose. So structure 13R5, also in this group, originally contained burial 1, and it too underwent a similar replacement with a patron deity shrine just a few decades later. And I'm going to be talking about that example a little later in the presentation. Another example of ancestor desecration took place later in La Corona's history. Okay, so sometime in the early 700s, ruler Teotihuacan Imagery came to power. And his family, as I've mentioned, was allied with Calakmul. He actually is married to a princess from Calakmul, which I'll be talking about later on. But the last recorded date for this ruler is in 745. Just a few decades later, a new king emerges here, but this one is allied with Tikal. And because of the real antagonism between Calakmul and Tikal throughout the classic period, this really suggests to me that this man is from a different lineage. And he's not from the same lineage as Teotihuacan Imagery. Okay. So recall this non-royal elite burial found here. This is burial 3. When this new Tikal-allied ruler came to power in the late 8th century, he made this structure here, 13Q3, the focus of a new program of hieroglyphic inscriptions. So he commissioned an altar here, which celebrates his relationship with Tikal. And he also commissioned a hieroglyphic staircase on the front of that structure. Unfortunately, this staircase is pretty much completely illegible at this point, but the few blocks that are legible suggest that it has some sort of a militaristic theme. It talks about captives. But as part of the same program of new construction on this building, structure burial 3, that non-royal burial, also appears to have been destroyed in a desecratory act. So here we've got a photograph of that burial. The burial was recovered down here. So here we have 2 ceramic vessels that haven't been excavated out yet. And off to the side here, you can see some of the stratigraphy. So we have these layers of fill. Here's a light layer and a dark layer, which were laid down over the centuries as this structure was built up. But then here, we have this really big intrusive layer where somebody dug a pit all the way down into the burial and then filled the hole in with dirt and rubble. And that dirt and rubble, actually, when it was excavated by Jan, was full of stuff from the burial itself. So he found human bones, he found jade and pearls, and all of it just discarded back in this pit that had been filled in. If that's not clear in the photo, here's a drawing of the same context. So the burial was down here, and then we have these layers of fill, and then we have this intrusive layer, which digs all the way down and then fills it back in with rubble before constructing this final phase architecture at the top. Okay, so this was probably another act of desecration perpetrated by the late ruler of the site to negate the claims of this ancestor's descendants to status and authority within the community. So from these examples, we can see that ancestors were both powerful means of claiming legitimacy, but they were also targets when political conflicts arose within this community. Okay, but the Maya of La Corona weren't just strategically venerating and desecrating these burials and these bones. They were actively taking steps to create ancestors in order to bolster their claims to legitimacy. Okay, so the first strategy they used to create ancestors was through royal marriages. So the rulers of La Corona used marriage alliances to strategically create ancestral links for their offspring. So I actually wrote the title and abstract for this paper, and I turned it into the organizers, and then I was emailing Marcello, and he said, you should have called this paper 3 Weddings and a Funeral. But it was too late, so. Okay, so here we have La Corona Altar 5. It's also known as the Dallas Altar. Some of you may be familiar with it. And here we see an image of 2 royal women. So the first on the right here, oh, and these women come from 2 different periods in La Corona history. We're seeing 2 different time periods, and they're sort of facing each other across the centuries. Maybe an example of folded time epistemology. Yes. Okay, so the first lady here is Lady Na Ek. She was the daughter of Khan ruler Tun Kabhish, and she came to La Corona in 1820 to marry the local ruler, who we just nicknamed Vulture, because we don't really know what his name was. She is portrayed wearing clothing that's of a Teotihuacan style, and she's also with this gigantic Teotihuacan style deity. So the ancient Maya frequently used imagery and iconography from Teotihuacan to signify a venerable antiquity and also political status of their ancestors. The woman on the left here is Lady Tikan. She is the wife of 8th century ruler Yehote-Kinich. And the text of this altar also mentions panel 1, which gives more details about the mythological connections to this place. So panel 1 was recovered from structure 13R5. The earlier phase of this structure had housed burial 1, which I was showing before. So there it is. And the second phase of this structure, which I've highlighted in blue, covered over this early ancestor shrine with a new patron deity shrine, just as had happened earlier with burials 2 and 6, as I described before. And what this hieroglyphic panel does, well, this panel is actually put right here on the bench of this new phase. And what this panel does is it justifies this replacement of an old ancestor shrine with a new patron deity shrine, basically by giving us a history lesson, but the history that Kinich Yok really wants us to hear. So first, this monument tells us that somebody came to La Corona in AD 314. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we think that La Corona really only was settled around this time, maybe slightly earlier. So this might be some sort of a founding event for the first people who came to La Corona. The person mentioned on this panel is probably the individual actually buried below in Burial 1, which also dates to this very early classic period. So maybe Burial 1 contains this early settler. The fact that Burial 1 was built in the same general proximity as Burials 2 and 6, and the fact that it was replaced at all with a new patron deity shrine, suggests that the occupant of this burial was from a different lineage than Teotihuacan, the king who is commissioning this monument. So the panel is essentially acknowledging the antiquity and importance of this early settler, but it goes on to claim an even greater antiquity for Teotihuacan's lineage, the 6-0 place lineage. It does this by describing a much earlier arrival of an individual from the mythological 6-0 place, which is associated with Teotihuacan. So this arrival took place, according to the panel, in 3805 BC, which we know is long before the site was actually inhabited. So we have an ancestral figure now who is arriving from a mythological location on a mythological date, which is really challenging this relatively recent arrival of the guy who's buried below. Finally, in AD 677, Teotihuacan rededicates this structure 13R5, as a shrine for a patron deity who is also said to be from the 6-0 place. So this act of replacing a defunct ancestor shrine with a temple to this god is justified with the rhetoric on this hieroglyphic panel. So the text creates a mythological antiquity for the 6-0 place lineage in order to refute claims to antiquity of other elites at the site of La Corona. Okay. So, in conclusion, Maya ancestor veneration was not a simple, straightforward set of practices. Instead, it was an arena in which political conflicts were played out. Strategic veneration, desecration, marriage, and mythologizing were all used to promote the legitimacy of elites over other lineages. We should not assume that Maya polities had a single ruling family in power for all time. Instead, many rival lineages combated with each other for political control, sometimes as allies and sometimes as enemies. The manipulation of ancestors played a key role in these power struggles. Thank you.